In the summer of 1944, somewhere in the chaos of northern France, a single telephone call redirected the fate of 800 men. Not a strategic decision made in a war room, not an order barked by a general. Just one woman sitting at a switchboard in a cramped underground bunker, her fingers moving across a tangle of wires and jacks, sending desperate cries for reinforcement to a base that didn't exist. Her name was Helen Kowalski, a 23-year-old Army communications operator from Cleveland, Ohio, and what she did in those 72 hours is a story the military buried so deep that most historians don't even know where to start digging. This isn't about a hero who charged into enemy fire. This is about a traitor who never fired a shot, who destroyed an entire armored regiment with nothing but patience, access, and a German accent she learned to mimic in the dark. Before the deception, before the isolation, before the slaughter, Helen Kowalski was exactly what the United States Army needed her to be: reliable, invisible, and forgettable. Communications operators were the nerve endings of the Allied advance, women tucked into basement command posts and mobile signal trucks, connecting field units to headquarters, artillery to infantry, tanks to air support. They worked 12-hour shifts in windowless rooms that smelled like cigarette smoke and sweat, their ears pressed against heavy bakelite headsets, their voices calm even when the officers on the other end were screaming. Helen had been recruited in early 1943, one of thousands of young women pulled from secretarial pools and telephone companies across America, trained for 6 weeks at Fort Monmouth in New Jersey, and shipped overseas with a single promise: your work will save lives. She believed it. In the weeks following the Normandy invasion, the communication networks were pure chaos, a spider web of field phones, radio relays, and improvised wire runs strung across hedgerows and bombed-out villages. Orders were late. Coordinates were wrong. Units called for help and got static. It was normal, it was war, and that's exactly why nobody noticed when Helen started making mistakes. The target was the Third Armored Regiment, a unit of roughly 800 men pushing east through the Cotentin Peninsula in mid-June, spearheading a critical flanking maneuver designed to cut off German reinforcements heading toward Carentan. They were operating in hostile territory, surrounded on 3 sides, relying entirely on a narrow supply corridor and constant communication with rear command. Colonel James Hartford, the regiment's commander, was a veteran of North Africa, a man who trusted his radios more than his maps. His communications officer, Lieutenant Frank Morrison, had standing orders to check in every 4 hours, relay position updates, request ammunition resupply, and confirm the availability of artillery support. It was a lifeline, it was routine, and on the morning of June 17th, that lifeline was quietly severed. Not by German shells or sabotaged equipment, but by Helen Kowalski, sitting 40 miles behind the lines, calmly rerouting every single call from the Third Armored to a frequency that led nowhere. The method was devastatingly simple. Helen had access to the main switchboard at a forward signals hub, a converted farmhouse basement where dozens of wire circuits converged before being relayed to higher headquarters. When a field unit called in, she would note the call sign, confirm the connection, and patch them through to the appropriate command post. But starting on June 17th, every time Lieutenant Morrison's voice crackled through requesting contact with divisional headquarters, Helen would acknowledge the call, pause for exactly 3 seconds as if checking the board, and then connect him to a dead relay station 20 miles south, a bombed-out schoolhouse that had been abandoned 3 days earlier. Morrison would speak into the void. He would repeat his coordinates. He would ask for confirmation, and he would hear nothing but faint static, the kind that sounded like a bad connection, not like annihilation. Helen would then log the call as completed, mark it successful in her records, and move on to the next incoming line. No alarms, no suspicion, just a regiment slowly going blind. What made Helen Kowalski so effective wasn't her technical skill or her access to classified information. It was her understanding of trust. The Allied communication system in June 1944 was held together by the assumption that the women operating the switchboards were beyond suspicion. They weren't officers. They weren't making tactical decisions. They were just connecting calls, following protocols, doing exactly what thousands of other women were doing across the European theatre. Nobody questioned them. Nobody audited their logs in real time. And nobody, not even the most paranoid counterintelligence officer, considered the possibility that the person you trusted to connect your desperate call for help might be the same person ensuring that help never arrived. Helen understood this. She had been recruited not by the Abwehr or the SS, but by a quiet, methodical officer named Hauptmann Klaus Weber, who had spent 2 years in America before the war and knew exactly how to identify someone hungry, isolated, and desperate enough to listen. The Third Armored Regiment spent 3 days calling for reinforcements that would never come, for artillery support that was never dispatched, for supply convoys that were never sent. They fought alone. They ran out of ammunition. They were encircled, shattered, and by June 20th, fewer than 200 men made it back to Allied lines. The official report blamed communication failures due to enemy action. Helen Kowalski continued operating the Switchboard for another 6 weeks before disappearing one night in late July. And the truth of what she had done wouldn't surface until decades later, buried in declassified Wehrmacht intelligence files that almost nobody bothered to read. This is that story. Helen Kowalski didn't grow up wanting to betray her country. She grew up in a cramped apartment above a butcher shop on East 65th Street in Cleveland, the youngest of 4 children born to Polish immigrants who worked 16-hour days and still couldn't afford to keep the heat on through winter. Her father died in a factory accident when she was 12. Her mother took in laundry. Helen dropped out of high school at 16 to work the switchboard at the downtown telephone exchange, connecting calls for businessmen and housewives who never looked her in the eye, never learned her name, never understood that the voice guiding them through the tangle of urban communication belonged to someone who was drowning in bills and silence. By the time the war started, she had spent 7 years plugging jacks into boards, saying the same phrases 1,000 times a day, living in a world where she was essential and invisible at the same time. When the recruitment posters went up in early 1943, promising travel and purpose and a steady paycheck, she didn't hesitate. The army didn't ask about her debts. They didn't ask why a 22-year-old woman with no family left was so eager to leave. They just needed her hands and her voice, and she gave them both. The training at Fort Monmouth was brief and brutal. 6 weeks of memorizing call signs, learning military protocol, and practicing the kind of calm, neutral tone that could cut through panic and static. Helen excelled. She had been doing this work for years, just with different clients, different emergencies. The instructors praised her efficiency. Her bunkmates found her cold. She didn't make friends. She didn't need to. By May 1943, she was on a troop ship heading to England, assigned to a communications unit that would follow the invasion force into France. She worked in London first, then Southampton, then finally in Normandy 3 weeks after D-Day, operating out of a signals hub that moved every few days as the front lines shifted. The work was exhausting and monotonous, exactly what she was good at. But something else was happening too, something she didn't talk about in her letters home, because there was nobody left to write to. She was running out of money again. The army paid her, but not enough to cover the debts she had left behind. The loans her mother had taken out before dying that winter, the collectors who didn't care that Helen was overseas serving her country. She was drowning again, and this time there was no switchboard in Cleveland to retreat to. Hauptmann Klaus Weber found her in early June, not in a dramatic recruitment meeting or a shadowy cafe, but in the most mundane way possible. He noticed her. Weber was a German intelligence officer embedded in the French resistance network, a man who had lived in Chicago before the war, who spoke flawless English, and who understood that the best assets weren't ideological fanatics, but desperate people with access. He had been monitoring Allied communication patterns for weeks, looking for weak points, and he saw something in the logs that caught his attention. A single operator, call sign November 7, was handling an unusually high volume of critical calls from forward units. She worked alone, she worked nights. And according to the personnel records he had managed to obtain through a collaborator in the local French administration, she was in debt, alone, and exactly the kind of person who might listen if someone offered her a way out. He approached her one evening in late June. not as a German officer, but as an American supply sergeant named Carl Becker, someone who claimed to have connections, who could help her settle her debts, who just needed a small favor in return. Nothing dangerous, just redirect a few calls, just for a few days, just enough to confuse one particular unit. She would be paid $5,000, more money than she would make in 2 years of army service. She said no at first, but he came back, and he knew exactly what to say. The decision Helen made wasn't born from ideology or hatred or political conviction. It was born from exhaustion and the kind of desperation that makes people believe they have no other choice. Weber didn't ask her to shoot anyone. He didn't ask her to plant bombs or steal documents. He just asked her to do what she already did every day, connect calls. Except this time, she would connect them wrong. He gave her a list of call signs, units that would be operating in a specific sector over the next 72 hours. He told her exactly which frequency to patch them into, a dead relay that would make it seem like the calls were going through but would never reach their destination. He explained that this would cause confusion, delay reinforcements by a few hours, give German forces time to reposition. He made it sound tactical. He made it sound small. He never mentioned the 800 men who would be left alone in hostile territory, who would call for help that would never arrive, who would die wondering why nobody answered. Helen took the money. She took the list. And on the morning of June 17th, she started redirecting the calls. The first time she did it, her hands shook. Lieutenant Morrison's voice came through, calm and professional, requesting contact with divisional headquarters to confirm artillery coordinates. She acknowledged the call, checked the list Weber had given her, and patched him into the dead frequency. She heard him repeat his message twice, his voice growing slightly more urgent before the line went silent. She logged the call as completed. She moved on to the next one. By the third call, her hands were steady. By the fifth, it felt like routine. By the end of the first day, she had successfully isolated the Third Armored Regiment from the entire Allied command structure, and nobody suspected a thing. She went to her bunk that night, stared at the ceiling, and told herself it was just confusion, just delays, just war. It wasn't personal. It wasn't murder. It was just a job. Colonel James Hartford first realized something was wrong on the evening of June 17th, roughly 9 hours after his regiment had pushed into a narrow valley east of Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte. The position was supposed to be temporary, a staging point before the main advance toward the German supply lines running south from Cherbourg. Intelligence had promised light resistance. Maps showed clear roads and open fields perfect for armor. What Hartford found instead was a killing zone, a bocage landscape of dense hedgerows and sunken lanes, where his Sherman tanks couldn't maneuver and German anti-tank teams had every advantage. By nightfall, he had lost 6 tanks and roughly 40 men, and the Germans weren't retreating. They were reinforcing. Hartford ordered Lieutenant Morrison to get divisional headquarters on the line immediately. They needed air support. They needed artillery. They needed to know if the flanking units that were supposed to be moving up on their left and right were still on schedule, because if they weren't, the Third Armored was about to be surrounded. Morrison made the call. He used the correct frequency. He followed protocol. And he got nothing but static and a faint clicking sound that suggested the line was open, but nobody was on the other end. He tried again. Same result. Hartford wasn't panicking yet, but he was starting to feel the edges of something worse than fear: isolation. Communication breakdowns were common in the first weeks after D-Day. Radio equipment failed. Wire lines got cut by shell fire. Atmospheric conditions caused interference. Morrison tried alternate frequencies, attempted to reach nearby units directly, even sent a runner with a written message to the closest relay station 5 miles south. But every attempt met the same result: silence or static, acknowledgements that went nowhere, promises of callback that never came. By the morning of June 18th, Hartford had to accept a grim reality. His regiment was alone. No air support had arrived. No artillery had fired in their sector. The supply convoy that was supposed to deliver ammunition and fuel at dawn was 12 hours late with no explanation. And the German forces that intelligence had described as remnants of a broken division were attacking with the kind of coordination and strength that suggested they knew exactly where the Third Armored was and exactly how vulnerable it had become. Hartford pulled his officers together in a farmhouse cellar that afternoon and laid out the options. They could hold their position and hope communication was restored. They could attempt to break out west toward Allied lines, or they could push forward and try to complete the original mission, cutting the German supply route even without support. The vote was unanimous. They would hold. They were American armor. They didn't run. What Hartford didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that every call his communications officer made was being answered by Helen Kowalski, 40 miles away, and every single one was being deliberately misrouted. Morrison would describe their position, the coordinates, the urgency of their situation, and Helen would acknowledge, confirm, promise relay, and then patch him into a frequency that terminated at an abandoned relay post. She would then log the call in her records as successfully completed, noting the time, the call sign, and a fabricated notation that contact with divisional headquarters had been established and reinforcements were being coordinated. Her supervisor, a captain from Delaware who barely looked at the logs, saw nothing unusual. The system was working exactly as designed. Calls were coming in. Calls were being connected. The fact that one particular unit was screaming into a void was invisible to everyone except Helen, and she made sure it stayed that way. She worked her shifts with the same mechanical efficiency she had perfected in Cleveland, never showing emotion, never hesitating, never allowing herself to think about what those voices on the other end were actually experiencing. By June 19th, the Third Armored Regiment was in full crisis. Ammunition was critically low, fuel reserves were nearly exhausted, casualties were mounting. German forces had completed their encirclement, and reconnaissance patrols reported enemy tanks moving into blocking positions on every escape route. Morrison was making calls every 2 hours now, his voice no longer calm and professional but edged with desperation. He was asking for anyone, any unit, any command post that could confirm they were being heard. Helen answered every call. She confirmed every message. She promised every time that help was coming, and she sent every plea into the same electronic grave. Hartford finally made the decision late on the 19th. They would attempt a breakout at dawn, pushing west through the weakest point in the German line, abandoning the heavy equipment they couldn't fuel and moving on foot if necessary. It was a retreat disguised as a tactical withdrawal, and every man in the regiment knew it. They also knew that if communication had been working, if someone had been listening, they wouldn't be in this position. They would have had support. They would have had a chance. Instead, they had silence. The breakout began at 0500 hours on June 20th, and it was a slaughter. The Germans had anticipated the move, positioned machine gun nests and anti-tank guns along the exact route Hartford had chosen, and opened fire the moment the first Shermans cleared the tree line. The regiment scattered. Some units made it through. Most didn't. By noon, the Third Armored Regiment as a functional fighting force had ceased to exist. Fewer than 200 men straggled back to Allied lines over the next 48 hours, exhausted, traumatized, and convinced they had been abandoned. The official after-action report, filed 3 weeks later, attributed the disaster to communication failures caused by enemy jamming and equipment malfunction. Nobody investigated further. Nobody asked why every single call for help had been acknowledged but never answered. And Helen Kowalski, sitting at her switchboard on the morning of June 21st, received a quiet visit from a man who called himself Carl Becker, who handed her an envelope containing $5,000 in American currency and who told her she had done excellent work. Helen Kowalski didn't sleep for 3 days after the money arrived. She kept the envelope hidden inside her footlocker, buried beneath spare uniforms and letters she would never send, and every time she closed her eyes, she heard Lieutenant Morrison's voice getting quieter, more desperate, more confused. She told herself it had worked exactly as Weber promised. A few hours of delay, some tactical confusion, nothing catastrophic. But the rumors started spreading through the communications unit by June 22nd. Whispered conversations between operators who had heard things on other frequencies. Fragmentary reports about a regiment that got cut off and torn apart somewhere east of Saint-Sauveur. Nobody had details, nobody used names, but Helen knew. She knew because she had been logging those calls, marking them complete, watching the timestamps pile up as Morrison called again and again, and she had done nothing except send him into silence. The money in her footlocker suddenly felt heavier than any debt she had ever carried. She thought about turning herself in. She thought about running. But mostly she just kept working, because the alternative was admitting what she had become, and that was a truth she couldn't face yet. Weber came back on June 25th, not as Carl Becker this time, but as himself, though he still wore civilian clothes and spoke English with that perfect Chicago accent that made him sound like someone who belonged. He found her during her break, sitting alone outside the signals bunker, smoking a cigarette she didn't want. He didn't congratulate her. He didn't thank her. He just sat down next to her and told her the truth. The operation had been more successful than anticipated. The Third Armored Regiment had been functionally destroyed. Over 600 casualties. Command structure shattered. Equipment abandoned. It was, he explained with clinical precision, one of the most effective acts of sabotage achieved by a single asset in the entire French theatre. Helen stared at him. She asked how many dead. He said the exact number wasn't confirmed yet, but initial estimates suggested between 400 and 500 killed or missing, with the remainder wounded or captured. She asked why he was telling her this. He said because she needed to understand her value, and because he had another job for her. Bigger target, more money. Same method. She told him no. She told him she was done. He smiled, reached into his jacket, and pulled out a photograph. Helen, sitting in a cafe in Southampton 3 weeks earlier, accepting an envelope from a man in a German uniform. It was fake. The uniform was added. The man was Weber in his Becker disguise. But it looked real enough to hang her. The leverage was perfect because it didn't need to be true. Weber explained it calmly, almost kindly. If Helen refused, he would ensure the photograph reached Allied counterintelligence within 48 hours. It didn't matter that she could prove it was doctored. The mere accusation would destroy her. Military tribunals didn't need absolute proof for collaboration charges, especially not when hundreds of men were dead and someone needed to be held accountable. She would be arrested, interrogated, and likely executed, and even if somehow she survived, her name would be synonymous with treason forever. Or she could continue working. One more operation, one more target. And when it was over, Weber promised he would disappear and she would be free, with enough money to vanish into civilian life and never think about switchboards or war again. Helen understood she was trapped, not by patriotism or ideology, but by the simple mechanics of blackmail. She had crossed a line, taken the money, made the choice, and now there was no path back. She asked what the target was. Weber told her it was a supply depot outside Carentan, critical ammunition stores that needed to be left undefended for exactly 6 hours while German commandos moved in. All she had to do was reroute security check-in calls, make it seem like everything was fine, let the guards think headquarters was monitoring them when nobody was. She took the assignment. She took the second envelope, and she hated herself more than she thought possible. But Helen Kowalski didn't complete the second operation. Not because she found courage or redemption, but because Weber made a mistake. On July 2nd, he contacted her again to finalize details, and this time he used a French intermediary, a woman named Isabel who worked in the laundry services and who was supposed to pass Helen a written note with frequency codes and timing instructions. Isabel was careful. She had done this work for months, but she didn't know that Allied counterintelligence had been tracking her for 3 weeks, following her movements, cataloguing her contacts, waiting for her to lead them to someone important. When Isabel approached Helen in the mess hall and slipped her the folded paper, 2 MPs were watching from across the room. They didn't arrest Helen immediately. They followed her. They watched her read the note, watched her burn it in the latrine, watched her return to her shift, and then they started pulling her communication logs, cross-referencing call records, looking for patterns. What they found was a ghost story. Dozens of calls from the Third Armored Regiment, all logged as completed, all routed to a dead frequency. It took them 4 days to piece together what had happened. By then, Helen knew they were coming. She disappeared on the night of July 7th, walking away from her post during a shift change and vanishing into the French countryside. The MPs found her footlocker the next morning, empty except for the photograph Weber had used to blackmail her, left behind either as evidence or confession. The manhunt lasted 2 weeks. They found Isabel and broke the network. They found Weber's contact protocols, but they never found Helen Kowalski. Some reports suggested she made it to Spain. Others claimed she was killed by German forces retreating through Normandy. The official record listed her as a deserter, and the details of what she had done were buried in classified files that wouldn't be opened for 50 years. The army didn't want anyone to know that 800 men had been isolated and destroyed, not by German strategy or Allied incompetence, but by a single woman at a switchboard who had been desperate enough to betray them for $5,000. The investigation into Helen Kowalski's actions revealed something the Allied command found more terrifying than the sabotage itself: how easy it had been. Counterintelligence officers spent weeks interviewing communications personnel, auditing protocols, examining the structure of the signals network that connected tens of thousands of troops across the European theater. What they discovered was a system built entirely on trust, where operators like Helen had near-total autonomy over call routing, where supervisors rarely checked logs in real time, and where the sheer volume of daily communication made individual verification impossible. A single person, sitting at a switchboard with access to frequency assignments and unit call signs, could redirect critical military communications with nothing more than a deliberate mistake and a steady hand. The system had been designed for efficiency, not security, because nobody had imagined that the quiet women connecting the calls might be the weakest link. The report that landed on Eisenhower's desk in August 1944 was blunt. Helen Kowalski had exploited a vulnerability that existed in every communications hub from London to the front lines, and if the Germans understood what she had accomplished, they could replicate it 100 times over. The solution was immediate and drastic: new protocols, redundant verification, random audits, and most importantly, silence. The Third Armored incident was officially attributed to equipment failure and enemy action, and Helen's name was scrubbed from every document that would ever be made public. But the men who survived knew the truth, even if they didn't know the details. The soldiers who staggered back to Allied lines in late June carried stories that didn't match the official narrative. They talked about calls that were acknowledged but never answered. They described Morrison making contact, hearing confirmation, and then waiting for support that never materialized. Some of them, the ones who had been on the radios themselves, remembered voices on the other end promising help, assuring them that reinforcements were being coordinated, telling them to hold their position because relief was coming. Those voices had been calm, professional, American. The same voice over and over, guiding them into annihilation with the practiced tone of someone who had done this work 1,000 times before. When the survivors tried to raise these concerns, they were told they were traumatized, confused, misremembering events in the chaos of combat. The military didn't want questions. It wanted the story to disappear. And for most of the men involved, it did. They went back to their units. They fought through France and into Germany. And they never spoke about Saint-Sauveur again, because nobody wanted to hear about the time they called for help and someone deliberately chose not to send it. Lieutenant Frank Morrison was one of the few who couldn't let it go. He survived the breakout with shrapnel wounds in his left leg and a certainty that something had been fundamentally wrong with the communication failures. After recovering in England, he requested access to the communication logs from June 17th through 20th, specifically the records from the signals hub that had been handling Third Armored traffic. He was denied. He requested again, citing his role as the regiment's communications officer. Denied again. When he tried to file a formal complaint through his chain of command, he was transferred to a logistics unit in southern England and quietly informed that continuing to pursue the matter would result in a court-martial for insubordination. Morrison understood the message. The army wasn't covering up incompetence. It was covering up something worse, something that couldn't be acknowledged without unraveling the entire trust structure that kept millions of soldiers functioning in a war where communication meant survival. He let it go, but he never forgot. Years later, after the war, he would write letters to military historians trying to get someone to investigate what had happened to his regiment. Nobody ever did. The official story was set. Equipment failure, enemy jamming, bad luck, not treason. The German side of the story remained hidden even longer. Hauptmann Klaus Weber survived the war, slipped through denazification proceedings using forged documents, and lived quietly in Munich until his death in 1973. His personal papers, discovered by his grandson in 2006, included detailed operational notes about recruiting and running Helen Kowalski, described in clinical terms as one of the most successful intelligence operations of the Normandy campaign. Weber wrote that the key to the operation's success wasn't Helen's access or technical skill, but her emotional state. He had identified her as someone already breaking under the weight of debt and isolation, someone the army had used and discarded into a role that made her essential but invisible. He didn't create her desperation. He just offered her a way out, knowing that desperate people don't think about consequences, only relief. The notes included copies of the fake photograph he had used for blackmail, along with a cold assessment. The subject was psychologically vulnerable and tactically expendable, ideal for single-use operations with high impact and low recovery probability. Weber never expressed regret. He expressed professional satisfaction. He had done his job. Helen had done hers. 800 American soldiers had paid the price. Helen Kowalski herself was never found, and her ultimate fate remains one of the war's unsolved mysteries. The last confirmed sighting was in mid-July 1944, when a French farmer reported seeing a woman matching her description walking east along a country road outside Bayeux, carrying nothing but a small bag and moving with the kind of purposeful exhaustion that suggested someone running from something they could never outpace. Some intelligence reports suggested she was killed during an Allied bombing raid on a German convoy near Falaise in August. Others claimed she made it to Switzerland and disappeared into the post-war chaos of displaced persons and refugees flooding across Europe. A few investigators believed she reached Germany itself, either as a prisoner or as someone seeking protection from the people who had used her. The most likely scenario, according to declassified CIA assessments from the 1980s, is that she died somewhere in France in late summer 1944, either by her own hand or at the hands of German forces who had no further use for her. There is no grave, no death certificate, no final accounting, just a name in classified files and a ghost that haunted Allied communication protocols for the rest of the war. The psychological weight of what Helen Kowalski had done began to surface in the fragmented accounts of those who worked alongside her during those final weeks before her disappearance. Other communications operators reported that Helen had become increasingly withdrawn after mid-June, working double shifts without complaint, volunteering for night duty when everyone else was desperate for sleep. She stopped eating in the mess hall. She stopped participating in the small social rituals that made military life bearable, the card games and shared cigarettes and complaints about officers. One woman, a switchboard operator from Boston named Dorothy Chen, later told investigators that Helen had seemed like someone waiting for a specific kind of ending. Not scared exactly, but resigned to something inevitable. Chen remembered asking Helen if she was sick, if she needed to see a medical officer, and Helen had just smiled and said she was fine, that she was just tired, that the war made everyone tired eventually. It was the smile that Chen remembered most clearly decades later, describing it as the saddest thing she had ever seen, the expression of someone who had already decided they were beyond saving. What none of Helen's fellow operators knew was that she had tried to stop the second operation Weber had assigned to her. On July 4th, 2 days before her planned sabotage of the supply depot communications, Helen had written a confession. Not to military authorities, but to herself, a 4-page letter detailing everything she had done, why she had done it, and what she believed the consequences should be. The letter was discovered years later in the effects of a French priest named Father Michel Dubois, who ran a small church near Isigny-sur-Mer. According to his own notes, Helen had appeared at the church on the evening of July 4th, disheveled and clearly in distress, asking to make confession. Catholic protocol meant Dubois couldn't reveal what she told him, but after her disappearance, she had left the written confession in the church office with a note asking him to deliver it to American authorities if she didn't return within 1 week. Dubois kept the letter for 30 years, paralyzed by the seal of confession and his own uncertainty about what delivering it would accomplish. The letter revealed that Helen understood exactly what she had caused. She named the Third Armored Regiment. She estimated the casualties. She described hearing Morrison's voice and knowing she was sending him to his death. And she explained in painfully honest terms that she had taken the money anyway, because $5,000 meant freedom and silence meant complicity, and she had chosen herself over 800 strangers she would never meet. The confession ended with a single line that Dubois found haunting enough to memorize. "I am not asking for forgiveness because I do not deserve it, only that someone remembers their names when mine is forgotten." Helen never completed the second sabotage operation because she couldn't make herself do it again. On the night of July 6th, when she was supposed to begin rerouting security calls from the ammunition depot, she sat at her switchboard for 3 hours, her hands hovering over the jacks and wires, unable to move. Every call that came through that night, she connected correctly. Every security check-in from the depot guards, she patched through to the proper command posts. When her shift ended at 0200 hours, she walked out of the bunker, past the sentries who barely looked at her because she was just another tired operator heading to her bunk, and she kept walking. She didn't take the second payment Weber had promised. She didn't take anything except the clothes she was wearing and the certainty that staying meant either completing the mission or being exposed when Weber realized she had failed him. Both options ended the same way, with her death. So she chose the only path left. She ran, not toward safety, because there was no safety for someone who had done what she had done, but away from the voice of Lieutenant Morrison that she heard every time she closed her eyes, asking for help that she had refused to send. The impact of Helen's actions extended far beyond the immediate tactical disaster of the Third Armored Regiment. Military psychologists who studied the case in the decades after the war identified her story as a perfect example of what they called moral injury collapse, the psychological phenomenon where someone commits an act so contrary to their own values that their sense of self disintegrates. Helen hadn't been a true believer in Nazi ideology. She hadn't been a trained spy. She had been an ordinary person pushed into an extraordinary situation by debt, isolation, and the kind of desperation that makes terrible decisions seem like the only option. What destroyed her wasn't the military consequences or Weber's blackmail, but the moment she heard the results of what she had done and understood that she had traded human lives for money. The confession she left with Father Dubois included a passage where she described lying in her bunk the night after the Third Armored was destroyed, doing the mathematics. $5,000 divided by 600 dead men came out to roughly $8.33 per life. She wrote that she couldn't stop calculating it, over and over, trying to find a version of the equation where the numbers made her feel like less of a monster. She never found one. The last confirmed interaction anyone had with Helen Kowalski was on July 9th, when a British military police patrol stopped a woman matching her description at a checkpoint outside Caen. She had no identification. She claimed to be a displaced French civilian. Her English was too perfect and her hands too clean for the story to hold, but the checkpoint was processing hundreds of refugees per day and the MPs were overwhelmed. They logged her as a possible deserter, took her name as Marie Fontaine, and told her to report to a civilian processing center in Bayeux within 48 hours. She never arrived. The last anyone saw of Helen Kowalski was that moment at the checkpoint, walking away into the summer heat, heading east toward the sound of distant artillery, one more anonymous figure in a landscape filled with people trying to outrun the consequences of war. Whether she found what she was looking for, whether she lived or died, whether she ever felt anything other than the weight of those $8.33 per life, nobody knows. She simply vanished, and the war moved on without her. The full scope of what Helen Kowalski had accomplished only became clear when German military archives were opened in the 1990s, revealing operational reports that painted the Third Armored disaster not as a lucky tactical victory, but as a meticulously planned annihilation based on real-time intelligence about Allied communication failures. Wehrmacht after-action reports from June 1944 described how German commanders in the Saint-Sauveur sector had received confirmation from their intelligence networks that a specific American armored regiment had been successfully isolated from its command structure. The reports didn't mention Helen by name, but they referenced a source designated as Asset Nightingale, a communications operator who had provided a 72-hour window during which the target unit would be calling for support that would never arrive. German forces used that window to reinforce positions, position anti-tank teams, and prepare a killing field with the confidence that no Allied air support or artillery would interfere. The operation was so successful that Wehrmacht intelligence recommended replicating the methodology in other sectors, though there's no evidence they ever found another Asset Nightingale. What the archives revealed was chilling in its simplicity. Helen hadn't just caused confusion or delay, she had gift-wrapped an entire regiment and handed it to the enemy with a precise timeline for slaughter. Colonel James Hartford survived the breakout from Saint-Sauveur, but he never commanded troops again. He was reassigned to a training position in England, officially due to wounds sustained in combat, though fellow officers whispered it was because he had asked too many questions about why his calls for help had been acknowledged, but ignored. Hartford spent the rest of his military career teaching tactics to replacement officers, and he died in 1958 without ever knowing the truth about what had happened to his regiment. His personal papers, donated to the Army War College after his death, included a journal entry from July 1944 that read, "We called and someone answered every time, promised us help was coming, told us to hold position. I heard her voice, professional, calm, American, and we believed her, we died believing her." That entry haunted military historians when it was discovered, because Hartford had identified the critical psychological element of Helen's betrayal. She hadn't just cut communications, she had maintained the illusion of connection, keeping the regiment in place, preventing them from making desperate decisions that might have saved lives, all while ensuring no actual help would arrive. It was sophisticated psychological manipulation, executed with nothing more than a switchboard and a steady voice. The survivors of the Third Armored who made it home after the war carried the scars of Saint-Sauveur in different ways. Some refused to talk about it entirely, burying the memory under decades of silence. Others became obsessed with understanding what had gone wrong, writing letters to the Pentagon, filing Freedom of Information requests, demanding access to communication logs that had been classified or destroyed. A veteran named Thomas McKinley spent 40 years trying to prove that the regiment had been betrayed, collecting testimony from other survivors, documenting the timeline of their calls for help, building a case that something more than equipment failure had occurred. He died in 2003, 6 months before the CIA declassified portions of the Weber files that confirmed everything he had suspected. His daughter, reading through her father's research after his death, found notebooks filled with questions he had never been able to answer. Who was on the other end of those calls? Why did they keep telling us help was coming? Did someone want us to die? The declassification gave her the answers her father had died searching for, but by then there was nobody left to hold accountable, no justice to be served, only the bitter confirmation that he, father's instincts had been correct, and the system had lied to him for 60 years. The psychological profile of Helen Kowalski that emerged from the combined Allied and German files painted a picture of someone who had been simultaneously ordinary and uniquely vulnerable. She wasn't a master spy. She wasn't ideologically committed to fascism. She was a working-class woman who had spent her entire life being invisible to the people she served, whether connecting phone calls in Cleveland or military communications in France. Weber had identified her as someone who understood systems, who knew how to make things work efficiently, and who was desperate enough to use that knowledge for money. The genius of his recruitment wasn't in appealing to her politics or her patriotism, but in recognizing that she had already been dehumanized by the very system she was asked to serve. The army had turned her into a piece of equipment, a voice without a face, essential but replaceable. Weber had simply asked her to be that equipment for someone else, and he had paid her what the army never would, enough money to escape. What nobody could have predicted was that Helen's own humanity would ultimately destroy her, that hearing the results of her actions would shatter whatever psychological barriers she had built to justify taking the money. The Second World War produced thousands of stories about betrayal, collaboration, and moral compromise, but Helen Kowalski's case remained unique because of its intimate scale and devastating efficiency. She hadn't betrayed strategic secrets to enemy generals. She hadn't sabotaged factories or assassinated leaders. She had simply sat at a switchboard, doing exactly what she had been trained to do, except she had done it wrong on purpose for 72 hours. The casualty count from those 3 days, 647 confirmed dead or missing from the Third Armored Regiment, represented one of the highest losses from a single act of sabotage by an individual agent in the European theatre. And yet, her name appeared in no war crimes trials, no official histories, no memorials. She existed only in classified files, and the fading memories of men who had heard her voice promising help that never came, a ghost whose greatest act was making 800 soldiers believe they hadn't been abandoned when they had been deliberately sacrificed. The question that haunted every investigation into the Helen Kowalski case, both during the war and in the decades after, was whether anyone could have stopped her. The answer, buried in the security reviews and protocol audits conducted in late 1944, was both simple and devastating. Yes, but only if someone had been looking. The communication system Helen exploited had multiple potential safeguards that were either ignored or never implemented. Call logs were supposed to be reviewed daily by supervisory officers, but in practice, they were filed and forgotten under the overwhelming volume of wartime traffic. Operators were supposed to work in pairs for critical circuits, providing mutual oversight, but personnel shortages meant solo shifts were common. Most critically, there was supposed to be a verification protocol where high-priority calls from isolated units triggered automatic confirmation checks with the receiving command post, ensuring that critical messages weren't lost in transmission. That protocol existed on paper. It was never enforced. Helen had operated in a system designed for efficiency rather than security, and she had understood instinctively that nobody was watching the watchers. The reforms implemented after her exposure, the redundant checks and mandatory audits, came too late for the Third Armored Regiment, but prevented dozens of similar operations that German intelligence had been planning based on Weber's success model. What made Helen's methodology particularly insidious was that she had created perfect deniability for herself while the operation was active. Every call she misrouted was logged as completed successfully. Every connection to the dead relay station appeared in her records as a proper patch-through to divisional headquarters. If anyone had questioned her during those 72 hours, she could have produced documentation showing she had followed protocol exactly, that the failure must have occurred somewhere downstream in the communication chain. The beauty of her sabotage was that it was designed to look like systemic failure rather than deliberate action. Morrison wasn't getting silence. He was getting static and dropped connections, the kind of technical problems that plagued military communications throughout the Normandy campaign. The regiment wasn't being ignored. They were experiencing the same frustrating breakdowns that dozens of other units dealt with daily. It was only in retrospect, when investigators pulled the logs and cross-referenced them with reports from the receiving stations, that the pattern became visible. Every single call from the Third Armored during that critical period had been deliberately terminated at a relay point that Helen controlled. The system had been corrupted from within by someone who understood it perfectly. The moral complexity of Helen's actions became a subject of intense debate among military ethicists and historians in later decades. Some argued that she was a victim herself, exploited by Weber's manipulation and driven by desperation that the army had created by using her labor without providing adequate support or compensation. Others maintained that regardless of her circumstances, she had made a conscious choice to trade lives for money, and that choice made her a war criminal. The truth existed somewhere in the uncomfortable middle ground where most real moral decisions live. Helen had been genuinely desperate, genuinely isolated, genuinely failed by systems that should have protected her. She had also genuinely chosen to redirect those calls, genuinely accepted payment for causing deaths, and genuinely maintained the deception even as men were dying. Both things were true simultaneously. She was a person destroyed by circumstances and a person who destroyed others to save herself. The fact that she ultimately couldn't live with what she had done, that she confessed and ran rather than complete the second operation, suggested some moral boundary she couldn't cross twice. But that boundary came after 647 men were already dead. The impact on Allied communication security extended far beyond the immediate protocol changes. The Helen Kowalski case created a permanent paranoia within military communication networks, a recognition that the most vulnerable point in any system wasn't the technology or the encryption, but the human beings operating it. For the rest of the war, and well into the Cold War era, communications operators faced increased scrutiny, more invasive background checks, and a culture of suspicion that assumed anyone with access could be compromised. The women who had served honorably in these roles, thousands of them who had worked exhausting hours under horrific conditions to keep Allied forces connected, found themselves treated as potential security threats rather than valued personnel. Recruitment for communication positions dropped, morale plummeted, and the military's relationship with the largely female workforce that had made modern warfare possible became strained by the knowledge that one woman, driven by desperation and manipulated by a skilled intelligence officer, had proven how fragile the entire system really was. Helen's legacy wasn't just the men who died, it was the erosion of trust in the invisible workers who made victory possible. The final documented attempt to locate Helen Kowalski occurred in 1951, when the newly formed CIA reopened the case as part of a broader investigation into wartime collaboration networks. Agents traced her movements through France in July 1944, interviewed the priest who had kept her confession, located the checkpoint where she had given a false name, and followed leads that suggested she had been seen in Paris in August and possibly in Lyon in September. The trail went cold at a displaced persons camp outside Geneva in October 1944, where a woman matching her description had registered under the name Anna Kowal, claiming to be a Polish refugee. The camp record showed she had stayed for 3 weeks before disappearing again, this time with no forwarding information or destination. The CIA investigator assigned to the case concluded that Helen had most likely died somewhere in Europe in late 1944 or early 1945, either from disease, violence, or suicide. The final line of his report read, "Subject demonstrated pattern of flight consistent with terminal guilt psychology. Recovery unlikely. Case recommended for closure." Helen Kowalski was officially declared presumed dead in 1952, and the file was sealed for 50 years. The story might have remained buried forever in classified archives, if not for a chance discovery in 2008 by a graduate student named Rebecca Stern, who was researching communication security protocols for her dissertation at Georgetown University. Stern had been granted limited access to declassified World War II intelligence files and stumbled across a redacted document referencing an Asset Nightingale operation in Normandy. The document itself revealed almost nothing, just fragmentary references to communication sabotage and a casualty estimate, but it included a cross-reference number to related files in the National Archives. Stern spent 8 months filing Freedom of Information requests, appealing rejections, and navigating bureaucratic resistance before finally obtaining access to portions of the Helen Kowalski investigation files. What she found shocked her, not because the story was particularly complex or involved high-level conspiracy, but because it was so mundane, so preventable, and so completely absent from every major historical account of the Normandy campaign. Here was a tactical disaster that had cost more American lives than many well-documented battles, caused by a single operator who had been driven to betrayal by debt and exploited by an intelligence officer who understood human desperation better than any interrogation manual. Stern's dissertation became a book published in 2011 titled The Switchboard Spy: How One Woman's Desperation Destroyed an American Regiment. It was the first comprehensive public accounting of what Helen Kowalski had done. The publication of Stern's book triggered responses from unexpected corners. Veterans organizations initially reacted with fury, demanding to know why the military had concealed the truth for over 60 years. Families of men who had died at Saint-Sauveur expressed grief mixed with rage, finally understanding that their fathers and grandfathers hadn't died because of bad luck or superior enemy tactics, but because someone had deliberately prevented help from reaching them. One widow, 87-year-old Margaret Morrison, widow of Lieutenant Frank Morrison, told reporters that her husband had spent 30 years convinced something was wrong with the communication failures and that the army had dismissed him as traumatized and paranoid. She died 4 months after the book's publication, having finally received confirmation that her husband's instincts had been correct, but too late for him to know he had been right. The army issued a brief statement, acknowledging the incident, expressing regret for the lives lost, and noting that security protocols had been substantially improved since 1944. They declined to comment further, citing ongoing classification of certain operational details. The statement satisfied nobody. The ethical debate surrounding Helen's actions intensified with public awareness. Some commentators argued she deserved sympathy as much as condemnation, pointing to the economic desperation that drove her decisions and the army's failure to adequately support its personnel. Others insisted that context didn't excuse consequence, that 647 dead men couldn't be rationalized away by debt and manipulation. Feminist scholars noted the gender dimensions of the story, how Helen had been valued only for her invisible labor, how the system had used her skill while denying her agency, how her desperation had been both created and exploited by male-dominated institutions. Military historians focused on the tactical implications, analyzing how a single compromised operator could paralyze an entire regiment. Psychologists examined her confession and the testimony of those who knew her, trying to understand the mental state of someone who could commit such an act and then be destroyed by having committed it. Everyone had an interpretation. Nobody had an answer to the fundamental question, what should we feel about Helen Kowalski? Hauptmann Klaus Weber's grandson, Martin Weber, gave a series of interviews after Stern's book was published, providing additional context from his grandfather's papers. Martin described Klaus as a man who had been proud of his intelligence work, who had viewed recruiting Helen as a professional triumph rather than a moral failure. Klaus had written in his private notes that Helen was the perfect asset because she wasn't motivated by ideology, which made her unpredictable and unreliable for long-term operations, but perfect for a single high-impact sabotage. He had anticipated that she would either be caught or destroy herself psychologically after the first operation, which is why he had prepared the blackmail for the second assignment. When Helen disappeared instead of completing the depot sabotage, Klaus had been mildly disappointed, but not surprised. He wrote that guilt was a design flaw in espionage, that the best intelligence officers learned to select assets who could either suppress it entirely or who could be controlled through fear when guilt emerged. Helen had been neither, which made her simultaneously his greatest success and an operational dead end. Martin Weber told interviewers that his grandfather had never expressed regret about any of his wartime activities and had died believing he had served Germany honorably. The contrast between Klaus Weber's cold professional satisfaction and Helen Kowalski's psychological collapse became a focal point for discussions about moral injury and the human cost of warfare. The search for Helen's final resting place became something of an obsession for amateur historians and family researchers in the years after Stern's book. Several claimed to have found her grave in various European cemeteries, though none of the identifications were ever confirmed. The most credible lead came in 2015, when a French genealogist discovered death records from a Catholic hospital in Toulouse, showing that a woman named Anna Kowal had died there in March 1945 from pneumonia. The physical description matched Helen approximately, and the timing aligned with someone who had been fleeing through France during the winter. But there was no photograph, no definitive identification, and Anna Kowal was a common enough Polish name that confirmation was impossible. The woman buried in a pauper's grave in Toulouse might have been Helen Kowalski, finally succumbing to illness and exhaustion after 8 months on the run. Or it might have been one of thousands of displaced Polish women who died nameless and alone in the chaos of post-war Europe. The uncertainty felt appropriate somehow. A woman who had made herself invisible for so long remaining invisible, even in death, existing only as a name in files and a voice in the memories of men who had trusted her and died because of it. So what do we do with a story like Helen Kowalski's? There's no clear villain here in the Hollywood sense, no Nazi mastermind or evil genius. Just a woman who worked a switchboard in Cleveland, who couldn't pay her debts, who got recruited by a man who understood that desperation makes people pliable, and who made a choice that killed 647 men she never met. She wasn't a monster. She was something more disturbing than that. She was ordinary. And that ordinariness is what makes this story so unsettling, because it forces us to ask questions we'd rather not answer. How many of us, drowning in debt, isolated and exhausted, offered $5,000 for a task that seemed abstract and remote, would have said no? How many of us would have had the moral clarity to refuse when someone presented it not as murder, but as a technical adjustment, a small favor, a few redirected calls? Helen's tragedy wasn't that she was uniquely evil. It was that she was uniquely positioned to cause catastrophic harm, while believing, or at least hoping, that the consequences would remain abstract numbers rather than real human suffering. She was wrong. And when she discovered how wrong she was, it destroyed her. The men of the Third Armored Regiment deserve more than to be footnotes in a story about their killer. They were husbands and sons, farm boys from Iowa, and factory workers from Detroit, men who had crossed an ocean to fight a war they believed was necessary and just. They called for help because they trusted the system that had sent them into combat, trusted that when an American voice acknowledged their desperate pleas and promised reinforcements were coming, that promise meant something. They died in hedgerows and sunken lanes, running out of ammunition while waiting for artillery support that had been confirmed but would never fire, holding positions because headquarters had told them to hold. Some of them died quickly. Others bled out over hours, calling for medics who couldn't reach them, wondering why the help they'd been promised wasn't arriving. Their last thoughts weren't about strategy or tactics or the grand sweep of history. They were about confusion and abandonment, about the terrible realization that they had been left alone. And the voice that had assured them they weren't alone, the calm, professional American voice that had promised them help, was on the way, belonged to someone who knew she was lying, who knew they were going to die, and who let it happen anyway for $8.33 per life. But here's what haunts me most about this story, and what should haunt anyone who learns it. The system that created Helen Kowalski is still with us. Not the specific switchboards and relay stations of 1944, but the fundamental structure that treats human beings as interchangeable parts, that extracts their labor while denying them dignity, that expects loyalty without offering security, and that creates the kind of desperation where betrayal starts to look like survival. Helen wasn't failed by one recruiter or one manipulative intelligence officer. She was failed by an economic system that left her drowning in debt, by a military that valued her hands more than her humanity, by a society that had trained her to be invisible and then was shocked when she used that invisibility as a weapon. None of that excuses what she did, but it explains how an ordinary person commits an extraordinary atrocity, and why the comfortable distance we maintain from people like Helen, the certainty that we would never do what she did, might be the most dangerous illusion of all. We're all one catastrophic circumstance away from discovering what we're actually capable of when the choice is between our survival and someone else's. The legacy of the Third Armored Regiment isn't on any memorial in Washington or marked by any monument in France. It exists in declassified files and in the fading memories of a few remaining relatives who learned too late why their grandfathers never came home. It exists in communication protocols that were rewritten because one woman proved how vulnerable trust really is. And it exists in the uncomfortable truth that modern warfare, for all its technology and precision, still depends on human beings making moral choices under conditions that make moral clarity nearly impossible. Every person who answers a phone, processes an order, follows a protocol, is potentially another Helen Kowalski. Not because they're evil, but because systems create opportunities for harm, and desperation creates motivation to seize them. The question isn't whether we would have done what Helen did. The question is what kind of society we're building that might one day ask us to find out. I want you to think about something before you click away from this video. If you were Frank Morrison, calling for help, hearing confirmation, trusting that voice, would you want to know the truth about what happened? Or would you prefer to believe it was just equipment failure, just bad luck, just war? And if you were Helen Kowalski, 23 years old, drowning in debt, offered an escape that required only that you redirect some calls, would you take it? Would you be able to live with yourself after? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're the questions that separate the stories we tell about history from the history we refuse to examine. The Third Armored Regiment died because one woman chose money over lives. But thousands of systems, military and civilian, function every day on the assumption that the people operating them will choose correctly when tested. Helen Kowalski is what happens when that assumption fails. And the terrifying truth is that we have no idea how many other Helen Kowalskis are out there, making choices we'll never know about, in systems we trust without question until the consequences become impossible to ignore. Remember their names, even if we've forgotten hers. That's all we can do now. Remember that 647 men trusted a voice, and that voice led them to their deaths. And ask yourself, who are you trusting today?